New tonight, Ukrainian drones struck one of Russia's largest oil refineries overnight. This is the latest in Ukraine's campaign to take out Russia's fuel infrastructure.
There are moments in war when the battlefield doesn't shift inch by inch, but collapses in a single strike. Moments when a main logistical artery, something built to last decades, is destroyed in a flash, and the operators don't even understand what happened until the smoke is already curling into the sky. This is one of those moments, because for months Ukraine had been watching Russia's most sensitive military lifeline, the Koltsevoy Fuel Ring, a 400-kilometer pipeline complex built to keep Moscow's armies, air bases, and missile battalions permanently fueled. They watched it fill and peak, and when it reached its heaviest load, millions of tons of gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel pressurized inside 3 parallel arteries, Ukraine struck it at the heart. And by the time Russia understood what hit them, all 3 lines were already gone. This wasn't a minor disruption. According to Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, HUR, it was a coordinated demolition of 3 fuel lines at the same time, deep inside Moscow Oblast. The pipeline that Moscow depended on to move fuel from Volgograd to the capital was suddenly offline. The system that carried up to 3 million tons of aviation fuel, almost 3 million tons of diesel, and over 1.6 million tons of gasoline annually, was gone overnight. And the way Ukraine did it was the part that caught analysts off guard. Not because drones were involved, that was expected, but because the strike happened in a region Russia treats as untouchable. A region blanketed with anti-drone radars, electronic warfare, and physical guards. Now let's talk about how it all went down. So every October, Russia pushes the Koltsevoy system to its annual peak, moving up to 7 million tons of fuel as winter approaches and frontline consumption intensifies. This is the time where a single failure becomes harder to contain. And that, right there, was the window Ukraine needed. This attack was built on timing, deception, and a level of coordinated execution that even Russian analysts now privately admit they didn't see coming. It begins on the night of October 30th, when Moscow was still boasting about a hypersonic missile barrage aimed at Kiev. But while Russia was watching the sky over Ukraine, Ukraine was watching the shadows around Moscow. The first phase of the operation didn't involve explosives at all. It involved confusion. Ukrainian operators launched a cluster of lightweight drones programmed to behave like amateurs. So what Russian APRs were seeing were erratic altitude changes, jittery movements, sudden course corrections. They mimicked hobbyists, not military assets. Russian radars picked them up, but flagged them as low priority. The system watched, tracked, then dismissed them as a nuisance. And this was Russia's first mistake. You see, under that cover, the real drones moved in. Unlike the decoys, these flew low, so low that Russian early warning radars had difficulty distinguishing them from the ground clutter. Those are just birds, Russian operators thought. And of course, they thought wrong. They pushed low along the tree line, hugging the canopy so tightly the drones were practically brushing the branches. This wasn't about flying fast, it was about disappearing. Their entire route had been charted through the radar dead zones Ukraine had spent months identifying from intercepted signals and tracking Russian scan patterns. In those gaps, the drones became ghosts, slipping through the air unseen. One of the drones carried something unusual, a fiber-optic tether spool, a thread thinner than human hair. In fact, it was so thin, it disappeared against the terrain. Through that tether, the operators could steer it with absolute precision, without pushing a single radio signal into the air. No RF meant no jamming, and no jamming meant no trace. That silence changed everything. Russian EW crews were scanning through frequencies convinced they'd catch a control link. They didn't realize the drone wasn't talking to the sky at all. Its link bypassed all radio detection, traveling straight through the tethered fiber. And that means it was also immune to every jammer on the front. While their spectrum analyzers stayed blank, the drone drifted even closer, threading past tree clusters. It was the kind of approach that doesn't trigger alarms. It creates that split second of confusion right before the hit. Then came the strike drone, the one that mattered most. It carried a shaped linear charge array designed not to blow the pipeline sky high, but to breach it precisely where the internal pressure was highest. Operators waited until the sensors confirmed maximum flow. You see, pipelines don't just carry fuel, they fight physics every second. We are talking about pressure gradients, temperature differentials, thermal expansion. And so, when they're full, they're vulnerable. When they're stressed, they're fragile. That fragility was the weapon. By 1:50 a.m., all 3 drones, silent, coordinated, and unseen, reached their staging points along the pipeline. Russian ground patrols were nearby, but they weren't looking in the right direction. They scanned the skies for missiles, not for machines gliding inches over the forest canopy. The drones positioned themselves above 3 separate segments of the Koltsevoy Ring, each carrying a different type of fuel flowing at hundreds of liters per second. And the countdown began. A subtle shift in thermal readings told operators the system was approaching peak throughput. It was barely a ripple. But to the Ukrainian operators watching from hundreds of kilometers away, it was the signal they had been hunting. The fuel ring was straining. Pumps were no longer idling. They were pushing at full capacity, humming at their highest efficiency after hours of uninterrupted flow. This was the heartbeat of Moscow's supply artery at its loudest and at its most vulnerable. They didn't even speak. They didn't need to. Everyone in that dim operations room understood exactly what that spike meant. The pipeline wasn't just active, it was at peak load, the moment when pressure equalized across every junction. When a system like that is stretched tight, a single rupture forces an immediate shutdown. But several ruptures? That's not a shutdown, that's a system collapse. At 1:57:34 a.m., the first device detonated. It didn't erupt with the kind of cinematic fireball most people imagine. It punched a sharp, brutal breach, forcing thousands of liters of diesel to erupt outward in a violent jet. Within a fraction of a second, pressure alarms across the Russian grid began screaming. Operators didn't yet understand what they were seeing. A mechanical failure, a valve blowout, a sensor glitch. Before they could answer, the second detonation hit. Gasoline. More volatile, more explosive. It tore a clean hole in the line, igniting instantly as vaporized fuel contacted the blast's heat. A fireball punched into the sky, visible from kilometers away. Russian emergency units scrambled. Local guards rushed toward the glow, unaware the third charge was seconds away from going off. And then, it did. Aviation fuel, which is basically kerosene refined to power fighters and bombers, erupted in a thunderous blast. Not the kind of volume that levels cities, but enough to obliterate the line and toss debris into the air like shrapnel. 3 explosions, each less than a second apart, synchronized so tightly that Russian monitoring systems initially logged them as a single catastrophic event. The firestorm that followed wasn't just flames. It was a chain reaction of physics and engineering unraveling in real time. Pressure dropped instantly, creating vacuums that sucked air into fractured steel, rattling pipelines like they were made of tin. Sections of conduit buckled, twisted, and collapsed under forces they weren't designed to withstand. Pumps upstream seized, their motors grinding to a halt, while valves slammed shut violently, sending shockwaves back through the network. Flow flatlined, leaving millions of liters of fuel trapped, unstable, and primed for secondary ruptures. Sparks from twisted metal ignited escaping vapors, sending tongues of fire leaping into the night sky. The surrounding terrain shuddered with each rupture. Even distant sensors registered the sudden thermal spikes. And in those seconds, the Koltsevoy Fuel Ring, the artery designed to keep Moscow's war machine alive, had died. Russian security forces arrived within minutes, but they were already too late. The pipeline couldn't be restarted. This wasn't a single rupture. They were dealing with simultaneous multi-site detonations engineered to collapse the system faster than crews could isolate each failure. This was more than sabotage. This was a coordinated takedown, because now Moscow's air bases, armored divisions, and logistics fleets were now dependent on reroutes. Not just longer routes, but slower ones. Trucks, rail cars. This is the kind of logistical substitution that makes commanders sweat. By dawn, smoke still poured over Ramensky district.
You're downplaying it. And I think, there's a reason for that, because oil and gas, the energy exports Russia has, are critical to its budget.
Russian media scrambled to downplay the incident. They called it a localized fire, even a workplace incident. But the numbers don't lie. Fuel flow had stopped, and the massive transport volume, the 7 million ton lifeline designed to feed everything from Su-35s to tank brigades, was offline. Ukraine didn't celebrate publicly, and they didn't need to. The operation spoke for itself. The strike wasn't just deep inside Russia. It was inside Moscow's own defensive ring, bypassing anti-drone systems, radar nets, electronic warfare, and patrol units with surgical precision. And that was the part analysts couldn't ignore. If Ukraine can infiltrate Moscow's fuel spine, synchronize multi-point detonations, and cripple a 400-kilometer energy artery, what's next? You see, war isn't always about who has more resources. Sometimes it's about who understands the enemy's blind spots better. And Ukraine has been clearing Russia on every level. You see, these attacks were not even about structural damage. The main objective was to cripple Russia's war efforts and even economy. Fuel convoys stalled on highways, their drivers waiting for orders that never came. Tanks sat idle in mud, engines cooling. Armored divisions planned for days of advance were suddenly limited to hours of operation. Aircraft grounded. Su-35s, MiG-29s, and transport planes couldn't launch. With this attack, Russia had created a 72-hour window where forces were deaf, blind, and effectively frozen. Control centers at refineries lit up with alarms as 7 million tons of fuel vanished from the network. Engineers scrambled to stabilize pressure and contain secondary fires, diverting resources from the front lines. By collapsing the pipeline, they froze Russian operations, immobilized troops, grounded aircraft, and created confusion from the front lines all the way to command headquarters.
If they are hit, and this was a big oil refinery up in the northwest part of Russia, if they're hit, this really can hurt Russia.
The destruction of the pipeline didn't stop at the battlefield. With millions of tons of fuel suddenly offline, domestic fuel prices spiked almost overnight, sending shockwaves through local markets. Civilians felt the ripple immediately. Transport costs rose, heating fuel grew scarcer, and industries reliant on diesel and jet fuel braced for disruption. Even the broader economy shivered as supply chains tightened, and emergency allocations were prioritized for military use. Russia is learning a harsh and costly lesson: never underestimate your opponent. So, the big question: if you were in command of Ukraine's drone operations, what would be the next high-value target? Drop your strategic picks in the comments below. We read every single one.